had a long conversation this afternoon with a journalist friend of mine, and we were discussing what was going to happen after the pandemic because London's been kind of freed up and loosened out as a result of the relaxation of the lockdown rules. So what happened in the conversation was that we started thinking about um, what the state of race relations was going to be post-pandemic. And that's what I want to talk about today, because nobody's discussing this at the moment. And the news is important for what it says as well as what it doesn't say. So this is about what's going to happen to race relations post-pandemic. I've got to ask this question because you play for the team whose jersey you wear. I'm a person of African origin. Race relations is an intimate part of my life because, from my point of view, there is quite a lot of institutionalized racism here within the United Kingdom. Of course, the majority population does not care to discuss this, does not care to address it, and indeed, at the latest opportunity for the government to address it, we were told by their appointed commissioner, Dr. Tony Sewell, that actually nothing to see here. Institutionalized racism is more or less a thing of the past. Class, culture, education, and religion are far bigger drivers of the outcomes, far bigger determinants of outcomes of life for people who aren't in the majority white ethnic groups. So it's really a bit like Marcus Rashford playing for Manchester United. He doesn't get to choose his midfield. The team he plays with is the team he has to support and play for. And so I'm pushing for my community because nobody else will play for us and nobody else will ask the questions that need to be asked. First of all, what's confusing is that a lot of the pushback for civil liberties has extraordinarily come from the right side of politics in the United Kingdom. People like recently Desmond Swain talked about the impact of lockdown on small businesses and on people who are doing kind of work in employment. This affects a lot of people of colour here in the United Kingdom. And he was saying, we've got to get people out to work and give them the protections that they require. David Davis, another person, still on the right side of politics, he was saying that vaccine passports would be prejudicial to people who need to go about their business, need to run their restaurants, need to get involved in the hospitality industries and that sort of thing. So again, here's a right winger, a Tory person, batting for the individual rights which concern many minority ethnics, particularly black people. But, and here's the big but, we also know the other side of David Davis's politics. So Derek Swain's I cannot speak for. David Davis is famous for being swathingly disrespectful to Diane Abbott, and in some of the comments he made about his fellow colleague in the Houses of Parliament, you can see that David Davis isn't, his longest suit isn't racial equity. I would say that David Davis is somewhat racist in his views and his attitude. So, on the one hand, it looks as if the Tories are the people who are pushing back for civil liberties, individual rights, and so on and so forth. And when those rights go, of course, it's people of colour who will experience their loss first and foremost. So anyone who's batting for civil liberties and civil rights and so on is willy-nilly ipso facto batting for black people. But we know that he is not, because we know what his views are on race. On the other hand, we also know what the Conservative Party, who commissioned Tony Sewell's reports, what their track record is on race. It is absolutely shabby and appalling. appalling. What is curious to me is that the Labour Party doesn't seem to have been very strong batting for civil liberties and individual rights. And they appear, or historically have always been, the political homeland of black people. So not a good look there. Secondly, I look one step above government. I go to the World Economic Forum. We all know about the Great Reset. I think I did a tape about it earlier on. And it's got a whole section on race. It's massive. It's a 301-page document, and the planning they've got around this is absolutely intricate. But in my reading of it, what I got more was kind of a gesture towards the idea of racial equality than real concrete steps which would address it. So I see from the World Economic Forum a few figureheads coming out, people like Ngozi Ubiala, who is now the Director General of the World Trade Organization, it's one of the most powerful offices in the world. Dr. Tedros Adhanom, who is at the DG of the World Health Organization, which is, if you like, the epicenter of world public affairs or world public health policy right now. So again, that's another very important post. Both of these people are Africans. So, well, is there a problem here? Well, that's just the thing. Just because there are a few very well placed and very visible black folk doesn't mean that institutionalized racism has gone away. Doesn't mean that the experience of the average black person on the street, for whom I must talk, has changed. Only this week, the young black boy in Minneapolis was shot dead by a white policewoman who reached for her pistol instead of her taser, and has now been heard to be telling the authorities over there that she forgot herself and it was an accident, and she reached for a lethal weapon and fired that, viz. Her pistol, rather than a far lesser level of violence being her taser, and instead of using that. So black people are still being shot and killed on a random basis in America. So nothing's changed there. It makes the thing all the more extraordinary that the trial of Derek Chauvin is taking place right now as we speak. And as, of course, you all know, Derek Chauvin was the person who leant on the neck of Mr. Floyd for 9 minutes, leading to his death. So the fact that we got a few figureheads in place does not mean that the experience of the average person in work, in health outcomes, etc., has changed. Nothing has changed there. My third point. If I go above the World Economic Forum, and some may find this a bit cheeky, but I find it rooted in some kind of fact. I go to the activities and the pronouncements of the one person who is probably the most visible on our planet at this time. That is Mr. Bill Gates, founder of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And I asked myself, a man with his wealth, a man with the kind of wealth and influence and reach he has, he could flip institutionalized racism just like that. If he wanted to. At any rate, he could really affect the outcomes on the street for young people of color. So I did a couple of searches, and this is what I came across as far as Mr. Gates was concerned. First, I went to Twitter, and I found three tweets. All of them happened on June the 10th, 2020. This was during the Black Lives Matters demonstrations. And here's the first tweet. Mr. Gates said, "The horrifying killings of George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and far too many other black people, and the protests they sparked are shining a light on the brutal injustices that black people experience every day. That's tweet number one. A few seconds later, he followed up, ... In policing, criminal justice, education, healthcare, housing, the workplace, and all other areas of their lives. Then a few seconds later, this was obviously a series. He went on to say, I am committed to listening and learning more about systemic racism and what I can do with my actions and words to help create a more equal and just future, because Black Lives Matter. Well, what did I make of that? I'll tell you what I made of that. If it's taken these demonstrations for one of the most intelligent, vaunted men in America to realize that we got a problem with racism, and he's an American, he's lived there all of his life, more or less, then I find that really, really strange. He, most of all, must be aware of the issues around race, especially as he's been working in America on Planned Parenthood, population control, and that sort of thing. And this is something with which he would come into contact with black people in their day-to-day lived experience in his country of America. So I find those tweets a bit strange. Now, then I looked elsewhere to see what kind of engagement he had with black people and came across this. Now, it turns out that Mr. Gates sponsors something called the Educational Trusting Corporation. And, bless him, he's invested $1 million in this educational think tank. Now, one of the things that this group in February of this year made the headlines with was they were talking about equitable, non-racist mathematics. Now, forgive me, I never was able to drill down to the bottom of how they were going to deal with mathematics in a non-racist way. However, I think it has to do something with the attitudes of the people who were tutoring students in mathematics, which would make sense. So, because this thing came in for quite a lot of, should we say, negative press, Newsweek reached, and here I quote, Newsweek reached out to the Gates Foundation asking if it agrees with those assertions and asking it to explain their exact meaning. Now, the group confirmed the donation of $1 million. That's the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The group confirmed the donation of $1 million, but was unavailable to comment further. Again, well, I'm going to leave you to come to your own conclusions about how committed Mr. Gates is to perhaps the most urgent problem facing his nation outside of our recent difficulties with the pandemic. So I know you're going to ask me this. What is my conclusion about what's going to happen to race after the pandemic? My personal view, race is off. It's absolutely off the agenda. Nobody's talking about race. Everybody's talking about vaccinations. Everybody's talking about health policy. Everybody's talking about regrowing the economy. But even if we scored 100 out of 100 on all of those things, when we come back after the pandemic, we'd have exactly the same social arrangements. We'd have exactly the same institutionalized racism. We'd have exactly the same difficulties with society being honest about its issues with race, with black people having to swallow it every day and make do despite all the obstructions they face. And basically, it'd be business as usual. So my conclusion, I may be wrong, Please share your views, share your comments underneath here. I've even created a little poll. This poll, forgive me, this poll is for PAO, people of African origin only. That's black people only, because they're the people who experience institutionalized and other forms of racism. Other people may think about it, hear about it, and so on. But I don't know any white people who are uh, uh, victims of institutionalized racism, shall I say. So forgive me. This poll is for black people. Please fill it out. Will it get better post-pandemic? Yes, no, or don't know. And I'm going to upload this video to my YouTube page. So if you see it there, please comment on YouTube, share it, and by all means subscribe to the channel. It gives me the freedom to bring you better researched and better produced material as we go forward. Thank you very much indeed. Please fill out the poll and let me know what you think.